In 1970, you could buy a three-bedroom house in Toronto for $13,000. That same house today costs $1.4 million. Your salary was $8,000 per year, and you were solidly middle class. Gas was 35 cents per gallon. A new car cost $2,000, and you could raise a family of four on a single income while saving money every month. But here's what nobody tells you about 1970 Canada. Life wasn't just cheaper, it was completely different. The country had 21 million people instead of 40 million. Montreal was the largest city, not Toronto. French-English tensions were so extreme that bombs were going off in Quebec. The Prime Minister had just invoked martial law, and the social rules, technology, and daily reality were so alien to modern life that 1970 Canada might as well be a foreign country. This is what life was actually like in 1970 Canada. Not the nostalgic version, the real version, where things were cheaper but also harder, simpler but also more restricted, and different in ways that would shock anyone who only knows modern Canada. A typical Toronto house in 1970 cost between $12,000 and $15,000. Vancouver houses were slightly more at $18,000 to $20,000. Montreal was cheapest at $10,000 to $12,000. These aren't inflation-adjusted numbers. These are actual 1970 prices. The average salary was around $8,000, meaning you could buy a house for 1.5 times your annual income. Today, that ratio is 10 to 1 or worse. A house costs 10 times what you make annually, not 1.5 times. The 1970 numbers seem like paradise. But here's what those houses actually were. No central air conditioning. Maybe a window unit in one room if you were lucky. But most houses just suffered through summer heat. No insulation in the walls by modern standards. Your heating bill was massive because heat leaked through walls, windows, and attics. Single-pane windows that frosted over in winter. No open tube wiring that's now considered a fire hazard. Asbestos in the walls and ceilings. Lead paint everywhere. The houses were small. Average new home size in 1970 was 1,400 square feet. Today it's 2,000 square feet. Kitchens were tiny with minimal counter space. One bathroom was standard. Two bathrooms meant you were wealthy. The basement was unfinished concrete where you stored things and did laundry. No family rooms, no home offices, no walk-in closets, and mortgages were different. Interest rates in 1970 were 8 to 10%, not the 2 to 3% of recent years. You needed a 25% down payment minimum. Banks wouldn't lend to single women. They wouldn't count a wife's income for qualification because they assumed she'd quit to have children. Getting approved required proving you'd been employed at the same company for years. So yes, houses cost $13,000. Lower quality, harder to finance, and required you to live with construction standards that are now illegal. Cheap isn't the same as better. Canadian television in 1970 was CBC English, CBC French, and maybe one private station if you lived in a major city. That was it. No cable, no streaming, no choice. You watched what was on when it was on, or you didn't watch television. The CBC shut down transmission at midnight. The screen would show a test pattern and play the national anthem. Then static. If you wanted entertainment after midnight, you listened to radio or read a book. There was no late-night content because broadcasting cost money and nobody was awake to watch it. But here's what made this even more restricted. The CBC controlled Canadian content. They decided what Canadians watched. American shows were limited by Canadian content regulations. At least 60% of programming had to be Canadian. This meant you got a lot of CBC-produced content, whether you wanted it or not. Hockey night in Canada on Saturday nights. Front page challenge. The Beachcombers. These were your options. If you missed a show, you missed it permanently. No recording, no rewatch, no streaming later. VCRs didn't exist yet. If you wanted to watch something, You had to be in front of your TV when it aired. This made television appointment viewing. Everyone watched the same things at the same times because there were no alternatives. The TV itself was a massive wooden cabinet with a tiny screen. A 19-inch screen was standard. 25 inches was huge. The picture was black and white for most people. Color TVs existed but cost $800, which was a month's salary. You got 3 channels on a good day. This is the part modern Canadians don't learn about 1970. In October, a terrorist group called the FLQ, Front de Libération du Québec, they demanded Quebec independence and the release of political prisoners. When the government refused, they murdered Laporte. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act. This suspended civil liberties across Canada. Police could arrest anyone without warrant, detain them indefinitely without charges, search homes without cause. Over 450 people were arrested in Quebec. Most were innocent, but had connections to Quebec nationalist movements. Armed soldiers patrolled Montreal streets. Tanks were positioned at government buildings. Was in chaos. Businesses were leaving. English speakers were fleeing to Toronto. The social fabric was tearing apart. This is why Montreal lost its status as Canada's dominant city. The instability scared away investment and population. Toronto surpassed Montreal in the 1970s and never looked back. The October crisis fundamentally changed Canada's trajectory. Modern Canadians think of their country as peaceful and stable. In 1970, there were literal bombs going off, and the military was occupying cities. In 1970, a married woman could not open a bank account without her husband's signature. She could not get a credit card in her own name. She could not take out a loan, either a husband or father. This wasn't policy. This was law. Women had only been allowed to vote in Quebec since 1940. 30 years before 1970, women couldn't serve on juries in some provinces until 1971. The idea of women as independent economic actors was still being debated. Banks assumed women would quit working when they had children, so they were considered credit risks. Employers could legally fire women for getting pregnant. Birth control had only been legal since 1969. Even married women couldn't legally access contraception. Abortion was illegal and would remain so until 1988. Women who needed abortions either had illegal procedures or traveled to the United States. Divorce required proving adultery, cruelty, or desertion. No-fault divorce didn't exist. But here's what this actually meant in daily life. A woman's economic existence depended entirely on her relationship with a man. If your husband died, you needed his estate settled before you could access joint accounts. If you divorced, you had no credit history because everything had been in his name. If you wanted to work, your employer could legally pay you less than men doing identical work. The feminist movement was fighting these laws, but in 1970 they were still on the books. Women's liberation was happening, but it was radical and controversial. The idea that women deserved equal economic rights was considered extreme left-wing politics. Mainstream Canada still operated on the assumption that women's primary role was wife and mother, and their economic activity was secondary to men's. A 1970 car had no airbags, no anti-lock brakes, no crumple zones, no seatbelt laws in most provinces, no child car seats, no side impact protection, no stability control. Cars were designed to look good and go fast. Safety was not a consideration. Seat belts existed but were optional and rarely used. Ontario didn't require seatbelt use until 1976. Other provinces followed later. Before mandatory seatbelt laws, usage rates were under 20%. Most people never wore them. They were considered uncomfortable and unnecessary. Children sat in the front seat. Babies were held in laps. There were no car seat laws because car seats barely existed. If you were in an accident with a child in your lap, that child became a projectile. Thousands of children died this way. It was considered normal. The cars themselves were built like tanks, but crumpled like paper. Heavy steel bodies that looked solid but provided no impact absorption. In a crash, the car stayed intact, and the humans inside absorbed all the force. Modern cars are designed to crumple and absorb impact. 1970 cars transferred impact directly to passengers. Drunk driving was socially acceptable. The legal limit was higher. Enforcement was minimal. Having a few beers and driving home was considered normal behavior. Traffic deaths in Canada were over 5,000 per year, with a population of 21 million. Today, deaths are around 2,000 per year with a population of 40 million. Cars were twice as deadly per capita. Telephones in 1970 were hardwired into the wall. You couldn't unplug them and take them to another room. You couldn't buy your own phone. You rented it from Bell Canada. Every phone in Canada was owned by the phone company. You paid monthly rental fees to use their equipment in your house. Long-distance calls required operator assistance. Dialed 0 and told the operator what number you wanted to reach. The operator connected you. Then you watched the clock because long-distance calls cost 50 cents per minute. That was an hour's wages. No call waiting, no voicemail, no answering machines. If someone called while you were on the phone, they got a busy signal and had to call back later. If you weren't home, they couldn't leave a message. They just called back repeatedly until you answered. Party lines still existed in rural areas. This meant multiple households shared one phone line. You could pick up the phone and hear your neighbor's conversation. You had to wait until they finished before you could make your call. Privacy didn't exist. Everyone knew everyone else's business because you could literally listen to their phone calls. No cell phones, no pagers, no way to reach someone who wasn't physically near a telephone. If you were meeting someone and they were late, you just waited. No way to call and check. No way to know if they were coming. You waited or you left. A typical 1970 grocery store carried around 8,000 products. Today they carry 40,000 to 50,000. Selection was limited because supply chains were local and food preservation technology was basic. No international food sections, no organic options, no gluten-free products. No prepared meals. You bought raw ingredients and cooked everything from scratch. Convenience food meant TV dinners, which were aluminum trays of processed mystery meat with corn and potatoes that you heated in the oven for 45 minutes. Produce was seasonal. Strawberries existed for 6 weeks in summer. No berries in winter. Oranges were expensive and considered special. Avocados were exotic. Selection varied by season because everything was grown locally or regionally. The modern expectation of year-round access to all produce from global sources didn't exist. Meat came from the butcher counter, where an actual butcher cut it in front of you. Pre-packaged meat on styrofoam trays didn't exist yet. You told the butcher what you wanted and how much. He cut it, wrapped it in brown paper, wrote the price on it with a grease pencil. Very personal, very slow. Checkout was different too. No scanners. The cashier looked at price tags and typed every price into the register manually. They had to know prices or check a list. Mistakes were common. Every item required finding the price, typing it in, and adding it to the total. A full cart took 10 to 15 minutes to check out. In 1970, over 50% of Canadian adults smoked. In restaurants, in offices, in hospitals, in airplanes, in grocery stores. There were no non-smoking sections because the entire world was a smoking section. Your doctor smoked in the examination room while checking your health. Teachers smoked in classrooms between classes. Office workers smoked at their desks while working. People smoked in hospital rooms while visiting sick relatives. Flight attendants walked down airplane aisles with cigarette service carts, offering passengers free cigarettes. No one thought this was strange because everyone did it. Anti-smoking research existed, but was dismissed as alarmist. Tobacco companies advertised on television. Cigarette ads showed doctors recommending specific brands for throat comfort. Athletes endorsed cigarettes. It was completely normalized. But here's what this actually meant for daily life. Every public space smelled like smoke. Your clothes smelled like smoke. After any outing, restaurants were hazier than modern vape shops. Non-smokers had no escape. The concept of clean air as a right didn't exist. You just breathed everyone else's smoke, and that was normal. Children grew up in smoke-filled homes. Parents smoked in cars with kids in the back seat. Teachers smoked in schools. The idea that secondhand smoke harmed children wasn't mainstream knowledge. Everyone knew smoking was bad for the smoker, but the concept that it harmed people nearby wasn't widely accepted. If you needed to communicate with someone far away, you wrote a letter, put it in the mail, waited 3 to 5 days for it to arrive, waited for them to write back, waited another 3 to 5 days for the response. Every correspondence took minimum a week round trip, usually 2. Bills came by mail. You wrote a check, mailed it back, waited for it to clear. This process took 2 weeks minimum. If you forgot to mail a payment, you couldn't just quickly send it online. It was late. You paid late fees. Your credit was affected. Banking required going to the bank during banking hours, which were 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., Monday to Friday. If you needed cash on Saturday, you got it Friday. No ATMs, no online banking, no mobile deposits. Every transaction required a human bank teller during restrictive business hours. Shopping meant going to physical stores. No online ordering. No Amazon. If you wanted something, you went to a store and bought it. If they didn't have it, you went to another store. If no local store carried it, you ordered it from a catalog and waited 6 to 8 weeks for delivery. Returns required going back to the store with receipt and item, arguing with a manager and hoping they'd refund you. This made life slower but also simpler. You couldn't impulse shop online at 2 a.m. You couldn't comparison shop across 50 websites. You went to a store, looked at what they had, and made a decision. Decision fatigue from infinite choice didn't exist because choice was limited by physical proximity and store hours. That $13,000 house was cheap because it had no air conditioning, minimal insulation, 1 bathroom, and 1,400 square feet. The $2,000 car was cheap because it had no safety features and would kill you in an accident. The $8,000 salary was enough because you didn't need smartphones, internet, streaming services, or any of the monthly subscriptions modern life requires. Life in 1970 Canada was cheaper, but it was also harder. More dangerous, more restrictive, more limited. No one had everything because everything didn't exist yet. You had a house, a car, a job, and a television with 3 channels. That was middle class. The nostalgia for 1970s economics ignores that you were living with significantly less. The trade-off for cheap housing was terrible housing quality. The trade-off for cheap cars was deadly cars. The trade-off for cheap food was limited selection. Simpler, more restricted life. Modern life is expensive because modern expectations are higher. We expect year-round produce from around the world. We expect safe cars with airbags and crumple zones. We expect houses with central air, proper insulation, and multiple bathrooms. We expect instant communication, unlimited entertainment, and global connectivity. All of that costs money. 1970 Canada was cheaper, but it was also a country where bombs were going off in Quebec. The past wasn't better. It was just different. Usually worse, but definitely different.